Any questions for me before we start today's lecture? Now, if you see your schedule, you have a midterm coming up next week because this is only a 5 weeks session. So next week would be the third week. So next week, I will lecture you only on Monday and Tuesday. That's chapter number 9 and chapter number 10. And your midterm is going to include all the chapters from chapter 1 through chapter 10. So Monday and Tuesday, there would be lectures. Wednesday, during the class time, you can work on your term paper or work on your midterm. There will be the discussion section though, so because you can go over if you have any questions for the midterm with UA. And Thursday during the class time, you have your midterm exam online. So Wednesday, Thursday, no lectures. It's preparation time and midterm exam. So after chapter 10, we will start resume the lectures again on week after next. So week after next, we will be doing chapter 11. Next week, chapter 9 and 10, and that is what is included all of from chapter 1 to chapter 10 in your midterm. So today's lecture is chapter 8, behavioral genetics or genetics of behavior. Now, what is behavior? We all say, this such and such person is very well behaved. What is behavior? Behavior is actually a very complex process. It's a mixture of course, a lot of environmental influences, but you'll be surprised to know that our behavior actually also is a reflection of our genetic input. So how we are going to react to a reaction, react to a particular stimulus, to a particular situation, actually a lot of it comes from our genetic predisposition. A person can be really very calm in a difficult situation, while the other person will react very differently and will get very agitated or upset or get hyper. So how we react to situations, our response is controlled by, to some extent, controlled by the genes that we have inherited, right? So behavioral genetics, this is what we're going to discuss today. A lot of behavioral problems, a lot of, even the things that we do not consider big problems are actually, there is input from both environment and genes. So behavior is complex. It's a continuum of emotions, intelligence, your personality, your moods, and behavior. It occurs in response to environmental stimuli, environmental triggers. But how we respond to these environmental triggers have some, contribution from our genotypes. So behavioral genetics actually studies a lot of how the nervous system works. So the anatomy and physiology of nervous system is very important for behavioral geneticists. So it's a little bit about the human brain. The human brain is the most developed brain in the animal world, weighs about 3 pounds. The nerve cells that make up human brain are known as neurons. Okay, this is the anatomical term for nerve cell. There are about 100 billion neurons in the human brain. And there are even more, okay, actually 2 to 3 times more of the supporting cells, which are not the nerve cell proper, but they are the ones that pamper the neurons, because the neurons are very precious cells. Why are they precious? Because after a certain stage in life, after 1 or 2 years of infancy, we do not make new neurons. So unlike our skin cells we are constantly making, because we are shedding our skin cells, old skin cells are dying, new skin cells are constantly being formed from the deep layers of skin. But unlike skin and some other cells, most other cells in our body, there are also a few types of cells in our body that we do not make after a certain stage of life. And neurons are those cells. They are the longest cells in our body, even longer than our skeletal muscle cells. And whatever neurons we form, the total number of neurons, it is being formed in the fetal stage, embryonic stage, and up to 2 years, 24 months of infancy. That is when our brain is still enlarging and new connections are getting formed. After that, no more neuron, no cell division in neuron. So in case there is a spinal cord injury or there is a brain damage, that is a permanent damage. Whatever neurons have been lost are lost forever. If they have been, of course, little bit of repair work is possible, but no complete regeneration. So neurons, that means your nerve cells, these are the cells that are making up your brain, your spinal cord. How do they control the activity of other functions? The fact that you can move your arms, your skeletal muscles are contracting, your bones are moving, is because your nervous system is commanding it to do so. So your brain and your spinal cord, they are actually the bosses in the body. So they are controlling the functioning of all other organ systems. And when a neuron talks to a muscle, so there is a junction at which there is talking going on. Talking means chemical talking. And those junctions are known as synapses or a synapse. So a synapse means the junction where one neuron can talk to something else on the other side. And that something else could be a neuron number 2. It could be a skeletal muscle. It could be a smooth muscle. It could be a gland. It could be a sweat gland. Your nervous system telling the sweat gland to start secreting sweat because your body is getting overheated. So how is the nervous system telling the sweat gland? It is talking to the sweat gland. And that talking is by means of chemicals. And those chemical signals are known as neurotransmitters. We have different types of neurotransmitters in our body. Okay, some of them are proteins, hormones, different types of neurotransmitters, which are released by the neurons. And they go to the effector organ or to another neuron, and they transmit a command, an order. They say something to the effector organ. And so genes that are controlling the production and distribution of these neurotransmitters, they play a very important role in your behavior, okay? If a certain neurotransmitter did not reach the effector organ because it was not made, or it was not made in adequate amounts, that means your effector organ is not going to behave the way it would have in a normal healthy person. This could lead to a lot of neuromuscular disorders. Okay, this could lead to mood disorders. So this figure shows you neurotransmission. This is how one cell of your nervous system looks like. This is a neuron. Okay, this part is the really long one. This is known as an axon. And when we usually say in common words, nerves, what do we mean by nerves? This is a nerve is getting pinched. A nerve means a bundle of these axons. So you see here, the electrical signal travels like this. It goes from these short branches called dendrites. It passes on to this expanded region. This is known as soma, or the cell body. This is where the information is processed, because all these dendrites are receiving thousands of stimuli, electrical signals at the same time. The soma will process the information, and then the soma will start passing on the orders one after another. It makes a priority list, and then the orders are passed along this length, the length of this nerve, the axon. And a second neuron, let's say on this side, receives the electrical signal, and then it also processes the information and will pass it on to the next part. Now, in place of this neuron here, this could be a muscle here, which is receiving the neurotransmitter. And if you see this figure here, this is this part expanded. So this is the neuron number 1. We call it presynaptic neuron. Okay, and this would be the neuron number 2, postsynaptic neuron. And the space between them, this is known as a synaptic cleft, and these little blue squares that you see here, these are the neurotransmitters. This is the chemicals which are coming out from the presynaptic neuron and are taking the message from the pre to the post. So when behavioral genetics is considered, there are a lot of different types of studies that are taken into account. And we learned about these studies in yesterday's lecture. You learned about empirical risk. You learned about how twin studies are used. Remember, we use different kinds of twins: identical, fraternal, identical twins separated at birth, or even adopted children. So adoption studies. People also, geneticists also use SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and see differences between maybe siblings or maybe even unrelated individuals. So genetic studies that talk about behavioral disorders, these are very challenging because of the traditional way of classifying these psychiatric disorders, how psychiatrists classify it. These may not be as discrete as what we see in what we would have seen in, let's say, a Mendelian trait. Okay, tall versus short. You cannot say in a behavioral disorder this versus this, because there could be a continuum of a range of different types of disorders. You know, a person might be a really very angry person, another person is a very calm person who doesn't get angry at all, and in the middle also we have so many shades of gray. Now here is a list of or prevalence of behavioral disorders in US. You see, starting with Alzheimer's disease, which is a heavy burden on any country's economy, because people start forgetting little things. They would initially might start forgetting in, you know, lapses, and the memory comes back. And then later on, as the disease progresses, the memory deteriorates further. They forget even their family members, they forget their own name. And you know, and in the later stages, they even forget how to chew the food. Or you take an Alzheimer's patient to the restroom and they don't know what to do. So a big burden not only on the patient himself or herself, but the caregivers as well. Anxiety, which is very common in today's fast world, with, you know, it's such a demanding, cruel world, that anxiety has become very common among the young generation. There are different kinds of phobias. PTSD, with our veterans returning from different parts of the world with a lot of PTSD. Generalized anxiety disorder, OCD. I once had a PhD student. She had OCD, and you could see on her lab bench all the buffers, all the chemicals had to be arranged. The bottles were all arranged in sizes from the biggest to the smallest. All the pens on her office desk had to be color coordinated. She even, the white lab coat that she wore, the pens in the pockets were all, and if you take just one thing out and you didn't put it back exactly in the same spot at the same angle, she will notice it and then she will try to correct it, and she couldn't sit still unless she had done that. So OCD, I guess all of us have, you know, OCDs to some extent, depending on how organized we are and exactly how we want things done. Panic disorder, ADHD, very common problem among kids these days. Okay, autism spectrum disorders, a whole, you know, wide spectrum of symptoms that you see in autistic kids. Some would be verbal, some would not be verbal. Drug addiction, eating disorders, mood disorders, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. So all of these, you see the prevalence. Some of these have really high prevalence. You go up to, you know, 8%, 7% of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and so on. So we'll start with eating disorders. In this country, about 5 to 10 million people have eating disorders. And again, eating disorder can go in the full spectrum. Some people, you know, think they are too fat and they wouldn't eat even though they need to. And some people just do the opposite. They just think, oh my goodness, I'm just so malnourished, I have to keep eating. And out of these, only 10% are male. So 90% of the women, I think it's also due to a lot of societal pressure. The society puts so much pressure on how a person is supposed to look, you know, right? Especially people start comparing themselves to what models are looking like, and they don't know how much effort has been put into making that woman, the model, look like what she is looking in the print media or in the digital media. Now, when geneticists did twin studies, they found out that eating disorders had a heritability ranging from 0.5 to 0.8. Now, just to give you a recap, we did this in last lecture, and this H value, the more a trait is controlled by your genes, the larger the value, okay? And then the smaller the value of H, that means it is more of an environmental influence. So the range is 0.5 to 1.8, up to 0.8. So there is a genetic component there. So genes whose proteins control appetite or regulate neurotransmitters that either make you hungry or not make you feel hungry, they may predispose you to eating disorders. So these are some of the common eating disorders. Anorexia nervosa, this is a psychological problem where a person thinks that I am obese, okay? So I need to eat less and less. And even though they are not eating and they're probably starving themselves to death, they still, whenever they look at themselves, they just feel they're so fat. So this leads to excessive weight loss. Bulimia nervosa is a similar kind of thing where person thinks I am too fat, but because they've been starving themselves, they cannot control. Every now and then they want to eat. So it's binge eating. And after eating, it's self-induced vomiting, because they want to enjoy the taste, but they don't want the nutrients to reach their stomach and make them fat again. So they will just, you know, throw up whatever they have eaten. Muscle dysmorphia is reverse anorexia. This is the psychological perception of being too small, so they have to keep eating. And I took this from internet, 3-4 years ago. This is a model. This is how she looked when she first started, and then she was battling anorexia nervosa, and she ended up looking like this. And then she realized that she needed professional help. So she wanted people to know about her story, and so she went public and she had her pictures there. You see, this is what, and she would still look at herself even at this stage, and she found herself to be obese. She thought she was obese. Sleep. Okay, we are going to talk about sleep disorders, but first, what is sleep? Sleep is this big question mark. We all know that sleep is required, and research has found that human beings, we need at least 8 hours of, sleep to stay healthy. So this is the vital behavior of unknown functions. If you do not let a person sleep for, there's a threshold value for every animal, then animals would die. A lot of research is being done on sleep, and people have already found out that sleep has several stages. It's not just one homogeneous process. So a person goes through these 4 or 5 stages, and then again those stages repeat. So there are different stages, and one of the stage, the 5th stage, is known as REM, rapid eye movement stage. And this is where the person is dreaming. So it is this 5th stage that is associated more with experience, environmental effects. So you might have done or seen something, and that is what is there in your subconscious mind and leads you into dreaming about it. So that is the 5th stage. But for the first 4 stages, they actually have a very strong hereditary component. Now, some sleep disorders. Narcolepsy with cataplexy. Narcolepsy means excessive sleepiness during the daytime, okay? And these people can fall asleep whenever. They just don't need even a quiet environment. They could be very actively doing something, and suddenly they have fallen asleep. And then this could be interspersed with periods of muscle weakness called cataplexy. And this disease was first found in dogs, Doberman, and then it was found in human beings. And the genetic basis was found out to be a mutation in a gene, which was making, this gene was responsible for making a neurotransmitter receptor, and that is hypocretin. And when there's a mutation in the gene, this receptor is not being formed. And actually, when I was growing up, I was growing up in India, and we had a babysitter who used to babysit me. My mom used to tell me, and at that time, of course, she didn't know about narcolepsy. And she was concerned because that babysitter could just fall asleep whenever. She would be talking and you just move, you don't look towards her, you're doing something, in 1 minute, she is already asleep. So now I understand that she probably had a narcolepsy. Another sleep disorder, familial advanced sleep phase syndrome. This disorder is characterized by it's a weird sleep-wake cycle, okay? Why is it that we human beings, we feel sleepy at nighttime in general, and we are awake during the daytime? It has got something to do with not only our body has a biological clock, and that biological clock actually responds to the day and night clock in the environment, okay? It's the sunlight, the amount of sunlight. And we have a hormone. That hormone is called melatonin. And melatonin hormone is secreted by a small gland inside your brain called the pineal gland. And that melatonin hormone, along with some other genes, is responsible for maintaining this circadian rhythm inside our body, our biological clock. And that is why people experience jet lag. So let's say you are here in the West Coast and you go to Europe, or you go to a country in Asia where there's several hours of time difference. What happens is your body in the first few days tends to feel sleepy when it is nighttime here in California, right? So it will take you a few days to adjust to the new timings. And that is when we say we are in jet lag. Why is that? Because our biological clock is still set here. So it will take, but gradually you will adjust. And then when you come back again, you have to readjust. So it is because it is changing in response to the sunlight that is outside. So the sunlight and the lack of sunlight is actually controlling our hormone secretion as well. Now, in some people with this problem, there are mutations in the clock genes. We call them clock genes in our body. And a particular family was, the subject of study. There were 5 generations. It was large family, and they all had this problem. These family members, they would feel sleepy early in the morning. They just wanted to sleep. Their biological clock was set like that. They were sleepy in the early hours of the morning. They would sleep through the day, and they became very active, hyperactive when it became evening. And this kept on happening generations after generation. And that's when the study was done, and they found out that there was a single base mutation in period 1 gene on chromosome 2. This is what was interfering with their sleep wake, or in other words, we call it the circadian cycle. Okay. And when you have the wild type gene, that means a normal healthy gene, it enables a person to respond to the day and night environmental cues. So when our body responds normally to the presence and absence of sunlight outside, but people with this mutation, they couldn't respond. So that's why their cycles were very different. Intelligence and intellectual disability. What do we mean by intelligence? This is a very relative term, right? As it's a complex and variable trait which is subject to multiple genes. There's not just one single gene. Plus, there are environmental influences, and there is intense subjectivity. A person could be very smart in a particular thing, particular art or craft or whatever, or in math or in something else, and could not be really that smart in something else. So it's also very subjective how you're looking at it. And we call a person intelligent in general because it's a combination, it's a combined trait of a lot of things. Again, genetic as well as environmental. Now, but we still human beings, we like to quantify everything. So human beings, we came up with this IQ test, intelligence quotient test. And this was actually first developed in France in 1904. And this was done to assess the success of, to evaluate the success of developmentally disabled children. Okay, so they were being given different types of therapies, and then these tests were being used to see if they were making any progress or not. Then later on, this test, this IQ test, was modified at Stanford University here, and then it was used to assess white middle class Americans, to see where their intelligence levels fall. And now this particular test, the heritability H factor for this test is 0.5 to 0.8 again. That means if it's up to 0.8, it's a very, very strong genetic component there. But do not forget that environment also plays a very important role. Now that this test is being used in general, it can be used on any population. They have come up with some average values, okay, mean of 100. They say if it's below 50, if a person's IQ level is below 50, that shows severe intellectual disability. If it is between 50 and 70, then there's mild disability. 85 to 150 is what is the 115 is the average intelligence range. This is where most of us will fall. And then above 150 would be above average intelligence. And I put this picture yesterday. I was going over the lecture and I thought I'll put Einstein's IQ here. Einstein's IQ was found to be 160 plus. So a lot of research has been done on Einstein. When Einstein was, just before his death, he had said that none of his body parts should be kept separate and should not be the subject of any kind of examination. But the doctors who did his post-mortem after his death, the pathologist, he actually saved Einstein's brain, didn't tell anybody, for several years after his death. He kept his brain preserved, Einstein's brain preserved in formalin for several years in his lab or in his house, I forgot where. And then after several years, when he was really old, then he disclosed the fact that he still had Einstein's brain with him. And that's when a lot of research was done. And of course, the IQ test was done before his death. But what I was going to tell you is that when his brain was analyzed, they found out that actually Einstein's brain had more than the average number of neurons that a person has. So of course that, that made him, why he could foresee so many things, why he could think in multi-dimension, why he could come up with the theory of relativity when it was so unthinkable for others, is because his brain really had, in fact, it had a lot more neurons than a normal or an average person has. So that's why the thinking, those connections, every time your neuron is connected to the number of neurons, the number of other neurons, that increases your thinking capacity. And IQ, it has been seen that it is a fairly accurate predictor of success academically in school as well as work. So when you get high IQ levels, you're doing better in school, and you are outperforming others at work as well. The IQ test, what exactly does it measure? It measures your verbal fluency. It looks at your mathematical reasoning, how much memory capacity you have, and your spatial visualization ability, how much you can visualize. And there are certain values that give you, so that the environment, actually, this is the conclusion, the environment has less of an influence on IQ as a person ages. So as you, in the young age, yes, your environment, because the young brain is like a sponge, it is absorbing everything. But as the person gets older, you will see that the genetics takes over more. Okay, then you how much you will forget and how much dementia sets in, there's a strong genetic component to it. Drug addiction. Drug addiction has become a huge problem, not only in US, but in all over the world. So how do we define drug addiction? When a person compulsively seeks drug and keeps on taking the drug despite knowing that it is going to adversely affect his or her health, that is known as drug addiction. That means you cannot stop yourself from taking it. Okay, and if you want to stop it, your body has become so dependent on it that a person starts showing withdrawal symptoms, and that is defined as scientifically then the person is addicted to drugs. So there are two characteristics of drug addiction: tolerance and dependence. Tolerance means as the person takes drugs, the body gets used to that particular dose of drug, and then the body needs more and more to get that effect of the drug. So the need to take more of a drug to achieve the same effect, this keeps it, it's a vicious cycle. It goes on and on until it kills the person. And dependence is the person's body has become so dependent on the drug that if you just abruptly stop the person from taking the drugs, and there would be withdrawal symptoms, which could be actually very serious, and this could kill the person, fatal. So drug addiction also has a heritability of 0.4 to 0.6. So not that strong of genetic component because it's only up to 0.6, it's more environment. Again, twin and adoption studies support rule of some genes in drug addiction. Okay. What drug addiction causes is it produces long lasting, some reversible, some irreversible changes in the brain. Okay. The brain changes that contribute to addiction are in the limbic part of the brain, the limbic system. Limbic system means there are structures on two sides of a part of thalamus. Thalamus is like the relay center of your brain. Like if you are calling an organization, it is usually the operator picks up the phone and they says, hello, this is this, how may I direct your call, right? And if you know your party's extension, then you say that. So the thalamus actually does that exact same thing in the brain. As we are getting a lot of inputs, visual inputs, auditory inputs, and they need to go to the top part, the cerebrum of your brain. The thalamus receives it, and the thalamus goes, how may I direct your call? And then depending on if it's a visual input, it needs to go somewhere else. If it's an auditory input, it has to go to the auditory part, and so on. So that is what the thalamus is doing. And there are structures on two sides of the thalamus, and when a person takes drugs, those are the structures that get affected. So let's say this figure shows you the events of addiction. A person takes a drug or alcohol, cocaine, whatever. The drug goes in and it changes, it causes changes in the expression of genes. The genes are making proteins. Those proteins are controlling signal transduction. They might be controlling the synthesis or production of a neurotransmitter, and so on. And as these proteins are changed, it causes change in the brain circuit. The brain is like a very complicated electrical circuit working perfectly in a healthy individual. But because of these proteins that are not being made because the gene got mutated, or for whatever reason, the genes got epigenetic change, neural connections, they start getting messed up. So the circuit is now messed up. It's not behaving normally. And this causes changes in behavior. This causes changes in dependence and tolerance. Now, these changes in the brain circuit could be short-term, could be temporary. Let's say when a person is under the influence of alcohol, the person would say something which when the effect of alcohol is gone, then the person regrets. But at that moment, when the person is saying those things, the person has no clue what is going on because the brain circuit is messed up at that moment. So what are the proteins that are involved in drug addiction? These are usually enzymes which are involved in the the long process of making a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter synthesis could involve, it could be a multi-step process. And those multi-steps might require different enzymes. And if those enzymes are damaged because of, or those enzymes are not made because of a gene mutation, then you're not getting that neurotransmitter. If you're not getting that neurotransmitter, you are not going to react. Let me try to explain this to you in very simple words, or this is a very oversimplified. Let's say you're taking a walk in San Bernardino Mountains, and suddenly you come face to face with a big bear. So immediately what do? You, depending on how, the distance or whatever, you run for your life. What helps you run, in superhuman fast, way, you will outpace yourself like anything. It's because of a rush of adrenaline hormone. So adrenaline, in scientific terms, we call it epinephrine. It's a neurotransmitter. It's because immediately there was a lot of neurotransmitter that came out. Now imagine if that neurotransmitter did not work. If you did not get that adrenaline rush, you wouldn't be running. You won't be able to run. It gives you it gives you superhuman strength. It's called fight or flight syndrome. So you won't get that. So, and this could be caused by a mutation in the gene. Now these neurotransmitters, when they are released from a neuron, from a nerve, they need to go to the effector, the neuron number 2 or the muscle. And the muscle or the neuron number 2 has receptors which are going to welcome the neurotransmitter, which are going to receive. Now, if something goes wrong with these receptors in the postsynaptic neuron, that means neuron number 2, then the effect is totally gone. You do not get the desired effect that the neurotransmitter would have produced. Now, most of these drugs of abuse that are commonly used, cocaine, opium, so on, these are mainly plant derived. And what happens is these chemicals, when they are inhaled or ingested, if they're eaten or smelled, they go and they might be competing, okay, with the neurotransmitters for the receptors. So instead of a neurotransmitter going and binding to its receptor, it is a harmful chemical that goes and binds to the receptor and would not let the neurotransmitter bind to the receptor. So it's like a competitive inhibitor. Now, some chemicals which are secreted by the human body, by our brain, these give you a feeling of what the drugs usually give people, that feeling of euphoria. That is actually, we also have some natural hormones that give you that feeling, that the feeling good that comes after exercising, okay? Or it is said after sexual activity also, you get these same hormones. These are endorphins and enkephalins. These are secreted by a really small gland in your brain. It's called the pituitary gland or the hypophysis, which is also known as the master endocrine gland. And these hormones, these actually are mainly intended in the body as pain relievers. So as soon as a person gets hurt and something, immediately the hormones get secreted and they go to the brain and kind of make you feel numb, so that you don't feel as much pain as you would have if it was not for these hormones. And these are the hormones that make you feel happy. These are the hormones that make you feel like you're in a perfect world. Everything is so rosy. So some candidate genes for drug addiction. Nicotine, commonly used drug, it binds a receptor that would normally bind to acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the most common neurotransmitter in our body. It helps in skeletal muscle contraction, okay? So nicotine would go, it would compete with acetylcholine, it would bind to the receptor, and this causes the body to release dopamine. And this gives body a sense of pleasure. So that is what this drug is causing, okay? So you see a lot of these genes for addiction include a lot of these receptors. So most of the times when it's behavioral disorders or drug related disorders, the genes that are getting affected are because those harmful chemicals are coming and binding to a receptors and not letting a protein do its job or a neurotransmitter do its job. Mood disorders. Mood disorders are those disorders that represent extreme of normal behavior, okay? So the two most common types of mood disorders are major depressive disorder and bipolar affective disorder. Major depressive disorder means when a person feels very sad, the person is chronically depressed and the person feels like nothing good is happening in my life, that is depression. Now, depression also has a continuum, wide range. Okay, everybody feels depressed now and then something doesn't go or your day didn't go well. At the end of the day, you feel sad. But when a person feels depressed, no matter what, days after days, long term, that's chronic depression. Bipolar affective disorder is where a person is very, depressed at one time, and at the other time, person becomes hyper, and goes into mania. So hyperactive, restless, might become even violent. So that is a bipolar disorder. 6% of US population is affected by major depressive disorder. And what is the biological cause for that? This is the deficiency of another neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is what affects your mood, your feeling of hunger, appetite, emotion, sleep. And now that the mechanism of major depressive disorder is known, and the mechanism was required to create a medicine to treat this, and it was found that serotonin deficiency is caused by the reuptake of serotonin by the presynaptic neuron, leaving little serotonin in the synapse. This is a difficult sentence to understand. So let us look at this figure here. If you see here, this is the presynaptic neuron. That means neuron number 1 that sends a message. This is the postsynaptic neuron, the one that was supposed to receive the message. So this presynaptic neuron is secreting its chemicals. These chemicals, these blue squares, are the neurotransmitter. In this case, it is serotonin. And the serotonin should go from neuron 1 to neuron 2 in a healthy person. But what is happening in case of depressed individuals is that the presynaptic neuron is there's a reuptake. This is taking in, again, this is serotonin. Instead of sending it to this postsynaptic neuron, it secretes it, but then absorbs it back. So the serotonin, instead of reaching neuron number 2, is taken back by the neuron number 1. So neuron number 2 is not getting anything. So that is causing a problem. That is causing the depression. So neuron number 2 not receiving serotonin is responsible for causing major depressive disorder. So when the mechanism was figured out, when scientists had already found this out, so now they knew that in order to treat this disease, what is the course of action? They have to somehow stop the neuron number 1 from taking back the serotonin. Sorry guys, it was Wi-Fi problem, lost connection, and this happens all the time. We are very lucky that it didn't happen in few of the previous lectures, but I keep losing Wi-Fi and comes back within a couple of minutes. So we'll resume from where we had stopped. I think I was explaining this slide. Can somebody tell me if I had already started? Were you still there when I was explaining this slide? Yes, okay. So I was telling that the disease is caused, the depression is caused when neuron number 2 does not get the serotonin neurotransmitter. This was the mechanism that was found by research. And then in order to treat this disease, then scientists immediately knew what to do. We have to stop neuron number 1 from reclaiming the serotonin neurotransmitter so that this is available to neuron number 2. So they put some inhibitors here. Okay, so they put selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, that would block the reuptake of serotonin by neuron number 1, leaving more of the neurotransmitter in synapses. And this is what helps patients who have depression. So they just take this particular, the drug that they are taking actually contains these SSRIs, okay, and which is preventing the serotonin from going back into neuron number 1. Okay, then next one is bipolar disorder. This is manic depression. This could be dangerous also. It affects only 1% of the population. The other depression is far more common. And this actually is associated with multiple chromosomal sites, and its genetic roots are difficult to isolate. Schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is the disease of delusions and hallucinations. This is loss of ability in a person to organize the thoughts and perceptions, and this person starts living in his or her own world, which is not reality. Okay, there's a withdrawal, total withdrawal from reality. Worldwide, 1% of the population might be affected. Usually you don't see this in kids. This is an early adult onset. You see progression, there are steps: difficulty paying attention, memory problems, learning difficulties, and finally psychosis or delusions and hallucinations. Before we do this slide, let me show you this. This was a very famous movie, 2001 movie called A Beautiful Mind. Probably, none of you have seen this, but if you get a chance, see this movie. This is a biographical drama based on a real life story, the real life story of a Nobel laureate. The Nobel laureate's life was John Nash, and Russell Crowe was the main actor in this movie. And even though you might have heard about schizophrenia, when you see this movie, then you realize how difficult it is for a person who has schizophrenia, because the hallucinations make him believe that whatever is he is experiencing is real. How does he differentiate between this is real and this is not real? So in this movie, which is based on his life, the Nobel laureate's life, at the end of the movie, where he is in Stockholm, he's receiving the Nobel Prize, and he walks out after receiving the Nobel Prize. Then this particular guy that he always used to see in his hallucinations, he had been seeing him for, by at that time it was probably 10-20 years. He's walking out, and this guy is again standing there and talking to him. And now, because he was an intellectual, he was an economist, and when he's not seeing those hallucinations, he knows that he is a patient and he sees hallucination. So, but he is looking at that person, and that person is as real to him as any other person. But then he tells this person, I know you are not real. I know you are in my hallucination, and I'm not going to listen to you, even though right now you're walking with me, you're talking with me. So I can, we have to understand that it's very difficult for people with schizophrenia to differentiate between the world that whatever is going on in front of them, in their eyes, what they see. Their brain is making them see something. Okay, it's like they're in the middle of a movie and everything is actually going on for real, but this is not real. But we know this is not real. So schizophrenia has a very strong genetic component, 0.8, okay? So strongly, genetically controlled, that means if a person's, if it runs in the family, there's somebody in the family who had it or some relative, then there's a, then that means the genes are making this person predisposed to having schizophrenia. And neural networking images of schizophrenic patients have shown that there is very characteristic fragmentation of the mind. So the neural signals are actually not flowing as smoothly as in a normal healthy brain. It's kind of like somebody's pausing, resuming these electrical signals. Okay, that's how it goes. And dozens of genes may actually interact with a little bit of environmental influences to cause this disease. One powerful candidate is, it has been found that infection during pregnancy. So if a woman was pregnant at that time, she got herpes virus or even chickenpox virus or flu virus, that could be a very strong environmental trigger for the unborn child. So the unborn child has experienced this environmental insult even before the person, the baby is born, and that baby could have a very strong, if genetically also it favors, and then baby could have very high chances of becoming schizophrenic in later life. Autism is, I think you all know, it's an autism spectrum of disorders, ASD, that is how it is called these days. It is characterized by progressive loss of language. So from an autistic child could be in the early on, could be saying a few words or even a few sentences, but later on in life, you see deterioration. The child even forgets or loses the verbal capacity. So communication and social skills beginning in early childhood. Some could have seizures, not all, mental retardation. Autism is affecting 3 to 6 children out of every 1,000, okay? And for some reason, it is affecting more boys than girls. There was a really old movie, I forgot which year, but even, I was in K-12 school, at that time it was called Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman, Tom Cruise. And in that movie, Dustin Hoffman had autism. And, there are cases even in real life where autistic people are geniuses in something else, because it is simply because the neural connections are not working like healthy individuals. So they could be really good in just one or two things, but they could be complete misfit. Socially they may not be very good, they are not very efficient. More than 30 genes have been associated with autism. 2 genes in particular, they are very good candidate genes, and research is, a lot of research from different parts have shown that these are the 2 genes that are playing an important role. The first one is a cell adhesion protein neurexin. Okay, this is in presynaptic neurons, whereas neuroligands or neuroligands in postsynaptic neurons. These proteins in normal healthy individuals, they strengthen connections at synapse. They make sure that signals pass, in continuity from presynaptic to postsynaptic neuron, and it is continuous, and there is no like interruptions in there. So keep the connection strong. But in autistic people, these 2 genes, there is problem in this mutation, and the proteins are not formed. So the connections are, again, just like other mental disorders, other behavioral disorders, the connections are getting fluctuations. That is why the talk between presynaptic and postsynaptic is not very smooth. So apart from that movie, you can also Google and find out there was a math wizard, an Indian mathematician named Shakuntala Devi, and her brain was, and there are Google, live videos, if you see on YouTube, her brain used to work faster than computers. And this was at those times where calculators, we didn't have scientific calculators and all. So even in front of live audience, she was given very difficult calculations, and she was doing it faster than in those days computers were doing. And she was autistic, okay? Not very mildly autistic, but it was just that her brain was made for mathematics. So this is the neurexin and the neuroligin that are problematic from, in autistic people. So autism may arise from failure of synapses to form. So the child is not able to integrate. So, how a complete movie is forming inside our brain is, we're seeing these different images, and then our brain is putting them all together. It's just like how in childhood we create these movies. So this continuous moving, is created because of a lot of proteins working together. So if there's a problem with these proteins, then you see it as fragments. You don't see it as one continuous movie. You see it as simple images, one after another. And there is a loss of connection between the images. And that is what is happening in the brain of an autistic person. And we are done with today's lecture. Any questions for me? Okay, please keep in mind whatever deadlines you have next week. You have your midterm on Thursday. So next week, again, I had mentioned this at the beginning of the lecture, only 2 lectures next week, lecture number 9 and 10 on Monday and Tuesday. Wednesday and Thursday, no lecture. On Thursday is your midterm exam. Okay, so we'll end the meeting now and I'll see you on Monday.